The amber glow of the university faculty lounge cast long shadows across weathered leather chairs, where two of history's greatest philosophical minds found themselves face to face on this crisp autumn evening. The setting was surreal yet oddly fitting. These titans of thought, transported through time, now sat across from each other with nothing but a small wooden table and centuries of intellectual tradition between them. John Locke adjusted his reading glasses, his empirical mind already cataloguing every sensory detail of the moment. The smell of aged books, the distant hum of fluorescent lights, the weight of his coffee cup, all data points feeding into his understanding of this unprecedented encounter. Across from him, René Descartes sat with the composed confidence of a man who had systematically doubted everything only to rebuild knowledge from the ground up. The tension in the room was palpable, not born of personal animosity, but from the magnitude of what they were about to discuss. Tonight's debate would center on one of philosophy's most enduring questions. Does the human mind arrive in this world as a blank slate, ready to be written upon by experience? Or does it come preloaded with certain fundamental knowledge and capabilities? Locke leaned forward, his eyes brightening with the anticipation of intellectual combat. René, my friend, I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite literally centuries. Your rationalist approach has always fascinated me, even when I've found myself fundamentally disagreeing with it. Descartes smiled, a hint of mischief playing at the corners of his mouth. John, the pleasure is entirely mutual, though I suspect by the end of this evening, you'll find that your beloved experience might not be quite the reliable teacher you've made it out to be. The moderator, a contemporary philosophy professor who had somehow orchestrated this impossible meeting, cleared her throat. Gentlemen, we're here tonight to explore one of the most fundamental questions about human nature and knowledge. John Locke, you've argued that the mind is essentially a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and that all knowledge comes from sensory experience. René Descartes, you've contended that certain ideas and principles are innate to the human mind. The question before us tonight is simple yet profound. Are we born knowing anything, or do we learn everything? Locke set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. If I may begin, I think we need to address the very foundation of how knowledge enters the human mind. When I look at a newborn child, what do I see? Potential, yes. Capacity, certainly. But knowledge? Actual understanding of the world? I see none of that. Descartes raised an eyebrow. But John, you're making a crucial error from the very start. You're conflating the absence of expressed knowledge with the absence of knowledge itself. A seed doesn't look like a tree, but the pattern of its growth is already contained within it. The philosophical battle lines were drawn. In one corner stood Locke, the champion of empiricism, ready to argue that human understanding emerges entirely from interaction with the world around us. In the other corner sat Descartes, the father of modern rationalism, prepared to demonstrate that reason and innate ideas form the bedrock of all true knowledge. As the debate was about to begin in earnest, both men felt the weight of their respective worldviews pressing upon them. This wasn't merely an academic exercise, it was a fundamental question about what it means to be human, how we come to understand ourselves and our world, and whether the mind is nature's gift or nurture's product. Locke straightened in his chair, his hands gesturing with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime observing how knowledge actually forms in real human beings. The confidence in his voice came not from arrogance, but from decades of careful study and reflection. René, let me paint you a picture, Locke began, his tone conversational yet purposeful. Imagine you're watching a child discover the world. She touches a hot stove and learns about heat. She tastes sugar and learns about sweetness. She sees the sun set and learns about color and light. Every single piece of knowledge she acquires comes through her senses, through direct interaction with reality. Descartes leaned back, already preparing his counterattack, but Locke pressed on with growing enthusiasm. You see, this is where your rationalist approach fundamentally misunderstands how the mind actually works. You assume there must be some pre-existing structure, some innate ideas that guide understanding. But I ask you, where is the evidence for this? When you strip away everything we've learned through experience, what remains? Locke picked up a pen from the table, holding it up as a prop. This pen has weight, color, texture, the ability to write. I know all of these things about it because my senses have informed me. I've seen pens, held pens, used pens. My understanding of penness isn't some mysterious innate concept. It's the accumulated result of countless sensory experiences with similar objects. The passion in Locke's voice began to build as he warmed to his favorite theme. And this extends to everything, René. Our ideas of justice, of beauty, of mathematical relationships, all of it emerges from our encounters with the world. A child learns fairness, not because it's programmed into her brain, but because she experiences being treated fairly and unfairly. She develops a sense of proportion, not through innate mathematical intuition, but by stacking blocks, sharing toys, measuring ingredients with her mother. Descartes shifted slightly, his analytical mind already working through several levels of response, but Locke wasn't finished. The genius of the human mind isn't that it comes preloaded with knowledge, it's that it has this incredible capacity to organize, compare, and abstract from sensory experience. We're born with the machinery for learning, not with the learning itself. Think about language, one of your favorite examples of supposedly innate structure. Yes, children learn language remarkably quickly, but they learn the specific language they're exposed to. A child born in France learns French, not because French grammar is written in her genes, but because French sounds surround her from birth. Locke's eyes lit up as he moved toward what he considered his strongest evidence. And consider this, René. If ideas were truly innate, shouldn't they be universal? Shouldn't every human being have access to the same fundamental truths? Yet we see enormous variation in how different cultures understand concepts like time, space, morality, even basic mathematics. The Piraha people of the Amazon have no words for exact numbers beyond 2. If mathematical concepts were innate, how do we explain this? The empiricist philosopher leaned forward, his voice taking on an almost missionary fervor. The beauty of the blank slate theory is its democratic implications. If we're all born with the same empty tablet, then differences in knowledge and ability come from differences in experience and opportunity, not from some predetermined hierarchy of minds. It means every child has the same fundamental potential for learning and growth. Locke paused, letting his words settle in the room. I'm not saying the mind is passive, René. Quite the opposite. The mind is actively engaged in processing, organizing, and making sense of sensory information, but the raw material, the actual content of knowledge, that comes from the world around us, not from some mysterious inner realm of pre-existing ideas. He gestured toward the window, where the campus stretched out in the fading daylight. Every tree that student sees, every face she recognizes, every emotion she feels, every thought she thinks, all of it traceable back to sensory experience, to interaction with reality. The mind is magnificent precisely because it starts with nothing and builds everything. Descartes had remained remarkably quiet during this exposition, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow, his fingers steepled in front of him as he processed each argument. The slight smile playing at his lips suggested he was far from convinced, and perhaps even a bit amused by his colleague's passionate certainty. "John," Descartes finally said, his voice calm and measured, "you paint a compelling picture, but I think you're overlooking some rather fundamental problems with your beautiful blank slate." Descartes set down his own cup with the deliberate movement of a man about to dismantle an entire worldview. His eyes held that particular gleam of intellectual excitement that comes from knowing you're about to reveal a fundamental flaw in your opponent's reasoning. "John, your passion for empiricism is admirable, but you're building your entire philosophy on quicksand," Descartes began, his tone gentle but firm. "You speak of a child learning about heat by touching a hot stove, but you're glossing over the most crucial question. How does the child know to interpret that sensation as hot rather than sharp or loud or any other possible category?" Locke opened his mouth to respond, but Descartes raised a hand with a slight smile. "Let me finish this thought, because it goes to the heart of everything. You assume that experience simply writes itself onto the blank slate of the mind, but experience doesn't come with labels attached. The world doesn't announce itself to us. When light hits our eyes, it's just electromagnetic radiation. How does the mind know to organize it into shapes, colors, objects, depth?" Descartes leaned forward, his voice gaining momentum. "You see, John, you've made the classic empiricist mistake. You've confused the content of knowledge with the structure that makes knowledge possible. Yes, I agree that a child learns French rather than Chinese based on what she hears, but the capacity for language itself, the ability to recognize that certain sounds carry meaning, to understand grammar, to generate infinite sentences from finite rules, that's not learned from experience. That's built into the very architecture of the mind." The rationalist philosopher stood up, beginning to pace as his argument developed. "Consider mathematics, since you mentioned it. You claim that mathematical understanding comes from stacking blocks and sharing toys, but here's what puzzles me about your theory. How can sensory experience, which is always particular and imperfect, give rise to mathematical truths that are universal and precise. Descartes paused by the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. When a child learns that 2 plus 2 equals 4, she's not just learning a fact about specific pairs of objects she's encountered. She's grasping a truth that applies to all possible pairs of objects, including ones she's never seen and never will see. How does your blank slate account for this leap from the particular to the universal? Returning to his chair, Descartes fixed Locke with an intense stare. And then there's the problem of the cogito. I think, therefore I am. John, this isn't something I learned by bumping into furniture or tasting soup. This is knowledge that comes from the very act of thinking itself. The moment I doubt my own existence, I prove it, because doubt requires a doubter. This kind of self-evident truth doesn't come from sensory experience. It comes from the rational structure of consciousness itself. Descartes picked up his pen, mimicking Locke's earlier gesture. You held up this pen and talked about learning its properties through your senses. But you missed the most important point. Before you can learn anything about the pen, your mind must already know how to distinguish between self and other, between subject and object. You must already have the concept of identity, of substance, of properties and relations. These aren't learned. They're the preconditions that make learning possible. The philosopher's voice took on an almost hypnotic quality as he developed his central theme. Think about a newborn infant, John. Yes, she appears to know nothing specific about the world, but watch her more carefully. She immediately seeks out faces, preferring them to random patterns. She responds to human voices differently than to other sounds. She has an instinctive understanding of number. She can distinguish between 1, 2, and 3 objects before anyone teaches her to count. These aren't learned behaviors. These are the mind's innate structures beginning to unfold. Descartes moved to his strongest argument. But here's the real problem with your blank slate theory. It makes knowledge impossible. If the mind truly started with nothing, no categories, no organizing principles, no rational structures, then experience would remain forever meaningless. You'd have a constant stream of sensations with no way to make sense of them. You need concepts before you can have perceptions. He sat back down, his voice becoming almost conversational again. John, you're absolutely right that experience shapes and fills out our knowledge, but experience can only work because the mind comes equipped with the rational tools necessary to organize it. The blank slate isn't blank. It's pre-formatted, like a computer hard drive that already has an operating system installed. Descartes smiled, but there was no smugness in it, only the satisfaction of a craftsman who had just executed a particularly elegant piece of reasoning. God, or nature, if you prefer, doesn't send us into the world defenseless. We arrive with the basic software of reason already running, ready to make sense of whatever data experience provides. The mind isn't a passive recipient of sensory information. It's an active, rational faculty that brings its own principles to bear on experience. Locke had been listening intently, occasionally shaking his head or jotting down notes. The slight furrow in his brow suggested that while he remained unconvinced, he recognized the force of Descartes' arguments and was already preparing his counterattack. The intellectual tension in the room had reached a crescendo, and both philosophers seemed to sense that they were approaching the deepest philosophical waters. Locke adjusted his position, his empirical mind working through the implications of Descartes' challenge to his foundational beliefs. René, you raise fascinating points about the structure of the mind, but I think you're making a critical error, Locke began, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. You're confusing the mechanisms of learning with innate knowledge itself. Yes, the mind has capacities, the ability to organize, to categorize, to form associations, but these are tools, not content. Locke's eyes brightened as he found his footing in this deeper level of debate. Let's examine your famous cogito more carefully. You claim that I think, therefore I am represents innate knowledge, but I would argue it represents the mind's capacity for self-reflection operating on the immediate data of consciousness. The child doesn't emerge from the womb knowing she exists. She discovers her existence through the accumulation of experiences that gradually build into self-awareness. The empiricist philosopher leaned forward with renewed energy. Watch how self-consciousness actually develops, René. A baby first experiences hunger, warmth, cold, comfort, discomfort. Gradually, through countless repetitions, she begins to distinguish between states that seem to originate from within and those that come from without. The sense of I isn't innate. It's constructed through the complex interaction of sensory experience and memory. Descartes raised an eyebrow skeptically. But John, You're describing the development of self-awareness as if it could occur without any organizing principle. How does the child know to group certain experiences as internal and others as external, unless she already has some conceptual framework for making such distinctions? Through pattern recognition and association, Locke responded immediately. The mind is extraordinarily good at detecting regularities and forming connections. Certain sensations consistently correlate with bodily states, others with environmental changes. Over time, these patterns solidify into concepts. It's not mystical, Renee. It's mechanical, but elegantly so. Locke stood up, beginning his own pacing routine. And this brings me to something crucial about your approach. You keep appealing to God or nature as the programmer of these supposed innate ideas. But this just pushes the mystery back one level. Where did God get these ideas? If they're truly rational and necessary, shouldn't we be able to discover them through reason and observation, rather than simply assuming their existence? The passion in Locke's voice grew as he moved toward his central critique. Your theory of innate ideas is ultimately lazy thinking, Renee. Whenever you encounter something complex or universal about human cognition, you simply declare it innate, rather than doing the hard work of figuring out how it actually develops. It's like saying that birds have an innate knowledge of flight rather than studying how they actually learn to use their wings. Descartes shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the force of this accusation, but Locke wasn't finished. Consider consciousness itself, your favorite example. You treat self-awareness as if it springs fully formed from some inner rational faculty, but consciousness isn't a thing or a property, it's a process. It's the ongoing activity of the mind organizing and reflecting on its own operations, and those operations are all grounded in sensory experience. Locke's voice took on an almost pleading quality as he tried to make his deepest point clear. Renee, you're looking for certainty in the wrong place. You want knowledge to be guaranteed by God or reason or innate structures. But real knowledge is always provisional, always subject to revision based on new experience. That's not a weakness, it's a strength. It means our understanding can grow and improve. He returned to his chair, fixing Descartes with an intense stare. Your innate ideas are conversation stoppers, Renee. Once you declare something innate, there's nothing more to investigate, nothing more to understand. But if everything comes from experience, then everything is open to study, analysis, improvement. We can trace the origins of our beliefs, test them against reality, refine them through careful observation. Locke's voice softened slightly, becoming more personal. I understand the appeal of your position. It promises certainty, foundational truths that can't be shaken, but that certainty comes at the cost of genuine understanding. If we really want to comprehend how the mind works, how knowledge develops, how humans come to understand themselves and their world, we have to be willing to trace everything back to its experiential origins. Descartes had been listening with the intensity of a man whose deepest convictions were being challenged by a formidable opponent. His fingers drummed silently on the table as he processed Locke's arguments, clearly preparing a response that would strike at the very heart of empiricism. "John," Descartes finally said, his voice quiet but carrying an undertone of philosophical steel, "you accuse me of lazy thinking, but I wonder if you've truly grasped the implications of your own position. If everything comes from experience, then how do you account for the reliability of experience itself?" Descartes' question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before a duel. The rational philosopher's eyes glinted with the confidence of someone who believed he was about to expose the fundamental contradiction at the heart of empiricism. "John, you speak of pattern recognition and association as if these were simple mechanical processes," Descartes continued, his voice gaining strength. "But you're glossing over something extraordinary. The mind's ability to recognize abstract patterns that transcend any particular sensory experience." Descartes moved to the whiteboard at the side of the room, picking up a marker with theatrical precision. "Let me give you a concrete example. Mathematics. You claim mathematical understanding develops from manipulating physical objects, stacking blocks, sharing toys. But consider this simple equation. 2 plus 2 equals 4. He wrote the equation on the board with deliberate strokes. Now, John, this isn't just a statement about specific objects a child has encountered. This is a universal truth that applies to any collection of discrete things anywhere in the universe. It was true before humans existed, and it will remain true after we're gone. How does your sensory experience account for this kind of universal, necessary truth?" Locke shifted in his chair, already formulating his response, But Descartes pressed his advantage. And then there's language, perhaps the most devastating evidence against your blank slate theory. Children don't just learn to repeat sounds they've heard, John. They generate completely novel sentences they've never encountered before. By age 3, a child can produce and understand an infinite variety of grammatically correct sentences. How does mere exposure to speech patterns account for this creative, rule-governed behavior? Descartes began pacing again, his excitement building. Noam Chomsky proved this decisively in the 20th century, though I was arguing the same point 3 centuries earlier. Children are exposed to limited, often imperfect speech, yet they rapidly develop the ability to use language with stunning sophistication. They know intuitively that certain sentence structures are impossible, even though they've never been explicitly taught these rules. The rationalist philosopher turned back to face Locke directly. This is what I mean by innate structure, John. The mind comes pre-equipped with what Chomsky called a universal grammar, a set of principles that guide language acquisition. Without this innate foundation, no amount of sensory exposure could explain how children master something as complex as human language. Descartes returned to his chair, leaning forward with intense focus. But let me press you on an even more fundamental point. You claim that all knowledge comes from sensory experience, but what about the reliability of the senses themselves? How do you know that your senses are giving you accurate information about the world? A slight smile played at Descartes' lips as he moved toward his famous argument. I can imagine being systematically deceived about everything I think I perceive. Perhaps I'm dreaming, or perhaps an evil demon is manipulating all my sensory experiences. Based on your empirical approach, you would have no way to distinguish between genuine perception and systematic deception. Locke opened his mouth to object, but Descartes held up a hand. But here's what I can't doubt, that I'm thinking, that I'm doubting, that I exist as a thinking being. This knowledge doesn't come from the senses. It comes from the immediate, rational apprehension of my own consciousness. This is knowledge that can't be shaken by skeptical doubt, because the very act of doubting confirms it. Descartes' voice took on an almost mystical quality. This is what I mean by innate ideas, John. Not that we're born knowing specific facts about the world, but that we have immediate, rational access to certain fundamental truths. The existence of the self, the principles of logic, the foundations of mathematics, the basic categories of thought, these aren't learned from experience, because they're the preconditions that make experience intelligible in the first place. The philosopher moved to his strongest challenge yet, and this brings me to the deepest problem with your empiricism. If all knowledge comes from sensory experience, then how do you account for knowledge about sensory experience itself? How do you know that you're having experiences, that you're the same person who had experiences yesterday, that your memories correspond to actual past events? These are precisely the kinds of foundational claims that can't be justified through appeal to more sensory experience without falling into circular reasoning. Descartes sat back, his expression serious but not unkind. John, your empiricism works beautifully for everyday practical knowledge. It's an excellent method for learning about the specific properties of specific things. But it fails completely when we try to understand the foundations of knowledge itself. For that, we need reason. We need innate, rational principles. We need the kinds of self-evident truths that no amount of sensory experience can provide. Locke had been taking notes furiously throughout this exposition, his empirical mind working through each challenge, testing it against his fundamental convictions. The intensity in his eyes suggested that while he remained unconvinced by Descartes' rationalism, he recognized that he was facing arguments that struck at the very core of his philosophical worldview. The room fell silent for a moment, as both philosophers contemplated the magnitude of what they were debating, nothing less than the fundamental nature of human knowledge and the architecture of the mind itself. Locke set down his pen with the deliberate motion of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. His eyes held the steady confidence of someone who had spent years thinking through precisely these objections and believed he had found their flaws. René, your arguments about mathematics and language are ingenious, but they rest on a fundamental misunderstanding of how complex abilities actually develop. Locke began, his voice carrying the authority of careful empirical observation. You look at the end result, a 3-year-old speaking in grammatically correct sentences, and conclude that the grammar must have been there all along. But that's like looking at a master pianist and concluding that sonatas must be innate, because mere practice couldn't account for such complexity. Locke stood up, moving to the same whiteboard Descartes had used. Let me walk you through how language actually develops, step by step. First, the infant is immersed in a rich environment of human speech, not random noise, Renee, but patterned, repetitive, emotionally charged communication from caregivers who are biologically programmed to exaggerate rhythm, melody, and structure when talking to babies. He began sketching a simple diagram as he spoke. The child's brain, which you're right to say has incredible pattern recognition capabilities, begins detecting regularities. Certain sound combinations occur together. Certain tones correlate with comfort or distress. Certain patterns predict what's about to happen next. This isn't magical innate grammar. It's statistical learning of extraordinary sophistication. Locke's enthusiasm grew as he developed his counterargument. And here's what you're missing about those novel sentences children produce. They're not generating them from some mysterious inner grammar. They're combining and recombining patterns they've extracted from thousands of hours of linguistic input. It's creative, yes, but it's creativity based on experience, not on pre-existing rational structures. The empiricist philosopher turned back to face Descartes. As for mathematics, you claim that 2 + 2 = 4 represents some eternal, universal truth that transcends experience. But I would argue that mathematical concepts are among the most clearly experiential of all our ideas. Numbers arise from our embodied experience of quantity, addition from our physical experience of combining groups, equality from our perceptual experience of matching and comparing. Locke's voice took on a passionate intensity. Watch how children actually learn arithmetic, Renee. They count on their fingers, they manipulate objects, they visualize spatial relationships. Mathematical truth isn't discovered through pure reason, it's constructed through countless interactions with quantifiable aspects of the physical world. The universality of mathematics comes not from its being innate, but from the fact that all humans share similar bodies and encounter similar quantitative relationships in their environment. Moving to Descartes' challenge about the reliability of the senses, Locke's expression became more serious. You ask how I can know my senses are reliable without circular reasoning, but you're demanding a kind of certainty that's neither possible nor necessary. Knowledge doesn't require absolute foundations, Renee. It requires coherence, consistency, and practical success. Locke began pacing, his empirical mind working through the epistemological challenge. My confidence in sensory experience comes not from some rational proof of its reliability, but from the fact that beliefs based on careful observation consistently prove more successful than beliefs based on pure speculation. The senses can deceive us, certainly, but we learn to identify and correct for these deceptions through more experience, not through retreat into alleged rational certainties. The philosopher's voice grew more pointed as he moved to his central attack on rationalism. And this brings me to the fatal flaw in your entire approach, Renee. You claim that your cogito provides absolutely certain knowledge, but what you've actually done is simply define doubt out of existence. Yes, if you're thinking, then in some sense you exist as a thinking being. But this tells us nothing about the nature of that thinking, nothing about its relationship to a physical body, nothing about its persistence over time. Your certain knowledge turns out to be almost contentless. Locke returned to his chair, fixing Descartes with an intense stare. More importantly, your appeal to innate ideas explains nothing. It's a philosophical dead end. When I ask how children learn language, you say it's innate. When I ask how we understand mathematics, you say it's innate. When I ask about consciousness itself, you say it's innate. But innate isn't an explanation. It's a label we paste on things we don't understand. The empiricist's voice softened slightly, becoming more philosophical. Renee, I think our fundamental disagreement comes down to different views about what knowledge is for. You want knowledge to provide certainty, to give us access to eternal truths that can't be shaken by doubt. But I think knowledge is a tool for navigating experience successfully. Its value lies not in its certainty, but in its usefulness. Locke gestured toward the window, where students could be seen crossing the campus in the gathering dusk. Look at those young people out there. They're not walking around paralyzed by skeptical doubt about whether their senses are reliable. They're using their accumulated experience to make predictions, form relationships, solve problems, create meaning. That's what the mind is for, Renee. Not to contemplate eternal truths, but to help us live effectively in the world we actually inhabit. The room fell quiet again, as both philosophers absorbed the full force of their respective positions. They had reached the heart of their disagreement, not just about where knowledge comes from, but about what knowledge is and what it's supposed to accomplish in human life. The debate had reached a natural pause, and both philosophers seemed to sense that they were approaching something like resolution, not agreement necessarily, but a deeper understanding of what truly separated their world views. The intensity in the room had not diminished, but it had evolved from combative to contemplative. Descartes broke the silence first, his voice carrying a note of philosophical humility that hadn't been present earlier. "John, I must admit that your practical approach to knowledge has a compelling simplicity. You're right that my appeals to innate ideas can sometimes function as conversation stoppers rather than genuine explanations." Locke looked up with surprise, not having expected this concession from his rationalist opponent. "But," Descartes continued, raising a finger, "I think you're underestimating the profound mystery of how any learning is possible at all. Yes, the mind has pattern recognition capabilities, as you say. But the very fact that it can recognize patterns, that it can extract abstract relationships from concrete experiences, that it can make predictions about future events based on past regularities, these are not simple mechanical processes, John. They require something like what I would call rational insight." Descartes leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps we've been talking past each other to some degree. When I speak of innate ideas, I'm not claiming that children are born knowing that 2 + 2 = 4. I'm saying they're born with the capacity to understand what it means for something to equal something else, what it means for relationships to be necessary rather than merely accidental." Locke nodded slowly, recognizing that his opponent was offering a more nuanced position. "René, I appreciate that clarification, and I'll admit that my empiricism sometimes glosses over the remarkable complexity of learning itself. The mind's ability to extract abstract patterns from sensory experience is indeed extraordinary, even if I don't think it requires appealing to supernatural explanations." The empiricist philosopher paused, choosing his words carefully. "But here's what I keep coming back to. Whatever capacities the mind possesses, they evolved through millions of years of interaction between our ancestors and their environment. The tools of learning aren't mysterious gifts from God. They're the products of natural selection operating on creatures who had to navigate complex environments successfully or die." Descartes smiled at this. "Ah, but John, that's almost my point exactly. Evolution didn't just randomly produce minds that happened to be good at pattern recognition. It produced minds specifically adapted to discover mathematical relationships, logical structures, causal connections, precisely the kinds of rational principles I've been defending. In a sense, natural selection has built rationalism into the very architecture of human cognition." The two philosophers looked at each other with something approaching mutual respect. They were beginning to see that their disagreement might be more about emphasis and interpretation than about fundamental facts. Locke spoke up again, his voice more conciliatory. "You know, René, perhaps our positions aren't as incompatible as they initially appeared. You're emphasizing the structural prerequisites that make learning possible, while I'm emphasizing the experiential processes through which learning actually occurs. Maybe both perspectives are necessary for a complete understanding." Descartes nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, the mind clearly comes equipped with powerful tools for organizing experience, but those tools need rich experiential input to develop and function properly. A child raised without language input never develops linguistic competence, no matter how sophisticated her innate capacities might be. And, Locke added, a mind without any organizing principles could never make sense of the blooming, buzzing confusion of sensory experience, no matter how rich that experience might be." The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. The two philosophers were no longer combatants defending fixed positions, but collaborators exploring the nuances of an immensely complex question. "Perhaps," Descartes mused, "the real question isn't whether knowledge comes from experience or from reason, but how experience and reason work together to produce understanding. The mind might be less like a blank slate and more like a sophisticated instrument that's designed to extract meaningful information from environmental input." Locke leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Or maybe it's like a musical instrument that comes with the capacity to produce beautiful music, but requires skilled performance and quality composition to realize that potential." As the evening light faded completely outside the faculty lounge windows, both philosophers seemed to recognize that they had reached something valuable, not a final answer to the question of human knowledge, but a deeper appreciation for its complexity. The mind, they had come to see, was neither a passive blank slate nor a repository of predetermined truths, but something far more interesting, an active, adaptive system that brought its own tools to bear on experience while being fundamentally shaped by that experience in return. The great debate between empiricism and rationalism would continue in philosophy classrooms and research laboratories for centuries to come. But on this evening, two of history's greatest thinkers had demonstrated something equally important. That genuine intellectual dialogue could transform disagreement into understanding, and that the deepest questions about human nature might require not choosing between opposing answers, but finding ways to honor the insights that make each answer compelling. The moderator, who had been quietly observing this remarkable exchange, finally spoke. "Gentlemen, I think you've shown us tonight that the question of how we come to know the world is as alive and vital now as it was when you first posed it centuries ago. The human mind remains one of the deepest mysteries we face, and perhaps our ongoing conversation about its nature is itself part of the answer." As the two philosophers gathered their notes and prepared to leave this impossible meeting, they carried with them not victory or defeat, but something more valuable, a renewed sense of wonder at the extraordinary fact that minds like theirs could exist at all, capable of questioning their own origins and reflecting on the very processes that make such reflection possible.